Hi, my name's Joe Shannon, and I work at a firm called Shannon Law Group, with some very talented people. So our firm represents people that are catastrophically injured in bad collisions, and a lot of times they demand some expertise. What I asked one of our attorneys, Patrick Cummings, to do was to really delve into this area of law during his practice. And during his years of practice, he's gotten repeated exposure to these cases. And in fact, I asked him if he'd be kind enough to write a book so that we could send it to our clients and our friends so they know exactly what's going on with these cases. And he did. He wrote a book called Avoiding a Trucking Nightmare. The good thing about this book is that you can download it from our website, but we'll also send you a copy of it. But hey, better than that, we have Patrick with us today to talk about some trucking litigation and trucking cases. So I'm hopeful that you'll enjoy this session. How you doing, Patrick?
I'm good. How are you, Joe?
Good. So first of all, why don't you give the listeners a little background about where you grew up and where you're from and how you got to the point where you're a lawyer practicing law in Illinois and Wisconsin.
Sure. So I'm sitting here in Chicago, which is where I live now, but where Joe's sitting in Woodridge is not far from where I grew up. I grew up in the neighboring town, Lisle. Went to St. Joan of Arc in Lisle, went to Bennett in Lisle, and then for college I went up to Marquette in Milwaukee with John Switek, who's another associate here at the firm. And then for law school, I started out in Drexel in Philadelphia, which is kind of a fun place to do my first year. And then it was a little too far from home, so I moved back in the Chicagoland area, finished up my last 2 years at Northern Illinois. I started clerking with Joe when I was a third-year law student and have been working with this firm ever since.
So let's talk about truck accidents. We'll get right to it. When somebody gets in a truck crash, usually it's a really bad injury. You handle a number of these cases, and we get these cases. Sometimes we get a call right away from the family, or sometimes we get a call 6 months down the road. What's the difference about getting that type of call right away versus 6 months later?
Yeah, so if you're involved in a serious truck accident, it's important that you minimize the time between the actual crash and when you reach out to an attorney. And here's the reason why. Every time that a truck is involved in a serious crash, the trucking company, one of their first calls, sometimes it's even before they call 911, they call their insurance company. And these insurance companies have these rapid response teams that will go out to the scene and will start collecting evidence immediately. And so a lot of times what happens with our clients is maybe they're in surgery or they're in the emergency room. And so they might not get to call an attorney right away. So there's already a lag between when the insurance company starts investigating your case and when we start investigating your case. So the quicker we can get involved and start investigating your case, collecting evidence and making sure that nobody's destroying evidence, the better it's going to be for your case ultimately.
Tell me some of the pieces of evidence that are key in these type of cases.
So one of the biggest ones that's important now, and it's been more important in the last 10 or 15 years than before, is every truck that's produced now is equipped with what's called a electronic control module. It's similar to like a black box in an airplane. And it records a ton of data. It's kind of amazing how much data you can pull from one of these things. You can see how fast a car was going, whether there was braking before a crash, what the angle of the steering wheel was. It's always recording as the vehicle's in motion. And then when there's an event, such as an impact or an airbag goes off or a hard brake, then all that data for 5, 10, 15 seconds, depending on the model, before that event is recorded. And so it's important that we get involved early so we can say to the trucking company, hey, this is important. We need you to preserve this. And we get a consultant out there to inspect it as soon as possible.
So I know that what we're seeing a lot of in the last couple of years is that a lot of these trucks are also equipped with video equipment. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Many trucking companies, especially the bigger trucking companies, are equipping their tractors with dashboard cameras. And there's two different types of dashboard cameras. There's outward facing. So basically the camera is showing what the truck driver would be seeing at the time. And there's also rear view facing, or that's facing into the cabin of the tractor, which shows you what the driver was doing at the time of the impact or in the 15, 20 seconds before the impact. And one of the reasons they do it is for litigation. They want to know, what their exposure is, whether they think their truck driver did anything wrong. The other reason is for training purposes. So if a truck driver, if you're watching a video of him and you notice that his eyes keep going down, and he's looking at his phone or he's looking at a map or he's adjusting the radio or trying to get on his CB radio or whatever, and his eyes are off the road, this is an 80,000 pound rig that he's driving. So his eyes need to be on the road, focused almost all the time. These bigger trucking companies will use that video and they'll flag when the eyes leave the roadway, and so that they can coach their drivers and say, hey, we noticed that at this time, when you're in this location, you weren't paying attention. And then they can retrain it on that issue.
Right. So those, the ECM, as well as the videos, those are absolutely, crucial. I mean, it's just common sense that folks understand that. And those are things that we don't want to go away because they would be helpful to their case. Because typically, we're getting cases where this big rig either wasn't stopping or changed lanes unexpectedly or did something erroneous and then ran over these folks who are helpless and really badly injured. So in fact, we have a case that Patrick and I are working on right now where we were lucky enough to get involved early and we did get all these things. And so we're just thankful for our client who's badly injured in this crash and that we found all that stuff out. So we obviously, if they're sending insurance adjusters out to the scene, we want our client to have an investigator go out to the scene. Why would we want investigators to go out to the scene of this crash?
Well, let me start with this. Insurance adjusters and their investigators that go out to investigate a crash, their primary goal is not to find out exactly what happened and to understand how this could have been prevented. Their job is to help the insurance company's case to keep money in their pockets and out of the injured victim's pockets. Okay, so it's important that every injured victim in a truck crash has an investigator that's out there looking to see, whether there's witnesses to this crash, whether there's physical evidence, photographing the scene, eventually getting an inspection of the truck, seeing what kind of damage was done to the truck, making sure you photograph the victim's car, whether it's in a lot or something. These are all things that you can't rely on an insurance company adjuster or investigator to provide to you fairly. You have to go do it yourself.
So there's a big truck crash. What do people typically recover in these type of cases?
So there's two primary categories of damages. One is called economic damages, and those are sort of easy to calculate damages. Those are things that there's actual bills for oftentimes. So that's medical bills. That's if you miss time for work. It's called lost wages. There's also something called lost earning capacity. And so we've had clients that maybe had one job and it was a really good job, but because of their physical limitations, they can't return to that job. So they have to find some other work that makes half or 60% of what they were making at their previous job. The insurance company could be liable to pay for the difference between what they could have made over the course of their career at the job they had versus what they will make at the job that they're able to get given their new physical limitations.
Okay, so you talk about economic damages. That's basically stuff that's countable and tangible and usually is going to somebody else. Medical bills end up going to the doctors and the insurance companies. The economic, basically the woman or man was working for a living and they were going to earn that anyway. So they're really not getting anything. There's other loss though too, right?
There is, and generally it's called non-economic damages. That's the crux of a lot of our cases. So if you injure your shoulder, you can have a surgery on your shoulder, you can repair the shoulder. Hopefully you can get back to some close to what your previous condition was. Oftentimes that's not the case. So you may be entitled to what's called pain and suffering, which I think a lot of people have heard and generally kind of understand. And then in Illinois, there's something called loss of a normal life, which is the inability to enjoy the pleasurable aspects of life. So that differs for all of us. So Joe, I know you're a runner. I know that if you got injured, a knee injury in a crash and you couldn't go running, that's something that would affect your daily life and it'd be something you would miss. We have other clients that, maybe are gardeners, or maybe they're basketball players or golfers or whatever. And if their injury prevents them from being able to do that, there's value to that, and an insurance company may have to pay for it.
For example, somebody that has a brain injury, and one thing that we've learned in handling brain injury cases, because a lot of times the brain is injured in these big, tremendous collisions, is that we really understand the mortality of people, and we understand that the brain is a very sensitive organ, and that losing just a little bit of brain function can really affect somebody.
Yeah, listen, the brain's not like an ankle or any other joint or bone. You could sit on the couch and not necessarily notice that you have an ankle injury for an hour or 2 hours. You can kind of escape from it. Your brain, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, you stick with it. And so a lot of our clients, if they feel like they're not as good as they used to be, the synapses aren't firing, or they struggle to find words, or they have short-term memory loss, that is something that just gives them stress and anxiety, knowing that they'll never be as good as they were from the day before the crash. That's an important loss to a lot of our clients.
One of the key parts of our job is to explain to juries just how significant it is to go from totally independent to full dependence on others or partial dependence. Think about how that would affect your relationship with your spouse, your kids, especially your work. Say for example, a surgeon who was just going gangbusters before, knew exactly where all the nerves were, knew exactly where all the muscles were, all these types of things. And then his mind gets scrambled just a little bit, or her mind gets scrambled just a little bit, how that can completely throw a haywire their whole livelihood. Not to mention all the different things that we're talking about as far as depression, other types of mood disorders, that type of thing that can happen. That's a big part of our job, is being able to communicate what that's like. Isn't that true, Patrick?
Yeah, and listen, independence is something that I take for granted every day. Less so now that I see clients that it changes in an instant. Piggybacking off your point, though, Joe, about the way it affects relationships, and we see it far too often with our clients, is you have an independent person with say a brain injury. They've been married for 25 years. Well, that strains that relationship with your spouse, because instead of a typical spousal relationship, now you kind of have a caretaker-patient relationship, and that's difficult. And so one of the real joys I've had in the last several years is we had a client who, she was injured in a crash. She spent more than a year in hospitals and inpatient rehab facilities. And as a result of the resolution of her case, we were able to get her back home. We were able to get her home retrofitted, and we were able to get her the home health care that she needed. So while she's not living fully independently, she's living a much more independent life than had we not been involved.
The other thing that people have to understand, and thing that we have to really communicate, typically the way a lawyer is paid that does the work that we do is that folks don't pay us an hourly fee. We don't send them any bills. We recover a percentage of the recovery. So, a percentage of the medical bills or a percentage of the lost wages, that's taking money right out of, right off the bat, just cut them off at the knees. But then even taking a more of a percentage when we get paid out of the, loss of a normal life, out of pain and suffering, and then also, we didn't talk about it, but disfigurement. Those are numbers that are the biggest part of the case, in my opinion, just because, who we are as people isn't how much medical bills are paid or how much lost wages there are. The most important thing is how this has really crucially affected your life. Have you found that experience, Patrick?
Yeah, what I have, Joe. And the thing is, in a perfect world, you wouldn't need plaintiff lawyers, because insurance company lawyers would, and their insurance company adjusters, they would understand the significant losses of their clients, and they'd be treated fairly. And unfortunately, that's not the case. And that's why we do have to get involved. Because part of our job, we talked about the investigation part earlier, but the other part is at the end of the day, we're kind of storytellers, and we need to be able to explain to a jury of 12 people, what happened in this crash, how it happened, how it could be prevented, and then more importantly, how it's affected your life, and then how it's going to affect your life as you go forward. And so I think that's one of our most important jobs as trial lawyers.
One of the things that strikes me when we handle these cases is that when we first get involved in the case, the facts seem very simple. Patrick and I had a case where a truck driver had taken a left-hand turn in front of a vehicle that was coming opposite way. Our lady was injured very badly and didn't remember any of the crash, not one bit. The truck driver had, at her deposition a couple years later, said that she had an arrow which allowed her to turn left, and so that meant that our client had a red light. Well, if that had been the facts of the case, that would have been interesting. However, what happened is we got involved in the case right away, and we were able to take statements and go take a look at the scene and do all sorts of our own independent investigation, and those facts did not add up whatsoever. It was basically a contrived story. So what's really important is for us to get into the understanding exactly why something happened. So in that case, what Patrick did, which I thought was terrific, was he really got to take a look under the hood of what was going on at this trucking company. And what we found out was all sorts of things that we had no idea was. Number one, they were monitoring this truck from point A to point B. They knew exactly where this truck was, and they never disclosed it to us. They had electronic monitoring of this truck, and they never disclosed it to us. And those records were gone. They got rid of the records. We also found out that every telephone call that was made by that trucker was recorded, also gone. Third thing we found out is that this driver was on her first independent trip, and she was a real young driver, a real nice person, but she had no business driving this truck at the time, and was in fact, we believe, lost at the time. And then fourth, we found out that there's an elaborate type of training that is involved when somebody's going to be driving a commercial vehicle, and she had not done that. So that was some of the reasons why. In fact, hey, Patrick, one of the questions I want to ask you, do you find out in your experience how typically how long these folks are driving before these crashes happen?
Yeah, and Joe, I think that the last story you told, I remember that case very well, and I think it highlights two things. One is the importance of early investigation, so we're able to go get the statements that we need that are to corroborate our version of what we think actually happened versus what the driver says happened at the time, and then what the driver says a year later after the attorneys get involved. But then it also, I think it's important to understand, and a lot of defense lawyers try to make this any crash case about the 5 seconds before the crash. And it was a mere moment of inadvertence. It was they just didn't see somebody coming. And as we kind of peel back the onion of a lot of these trucking companies, we have to turn the clock back a little bit more. And it goes from why was this driver hired? What kind of vetting did you do? Did you look at her motor vehicle record? How long had she been driving any car? How long had she been driving commercial vehicles? Then you get into, well, what's your training program look like? As a new driver that comes in, what kind of things do you do to make sure that they're able to safely operate the vehicles that they're going to be expected to operate as part of their job? And in that particular case, we found out that they did basically nothing with the vetting, nothing with the training. And like you said, this girl basically was put in a horrible position where she was driving a car that or a truck that she wasn't capable of driving safely. And so as opposed to being a mere moment of inadvertence, it was kind of a ticking time bomb. This was bound to happen. It just unfortunately happened to our client.
Let's talk about punitive damages for a second. So you and I have been involved in cases in which we're seeking punitive damages. In fact, we had a case go to verdict in a cab case in which our client recovered a significant punitive damages award. Why don't you tell the listeners what exactly punitive damages are?
So punitive damages are not directly related to the losses sustained by the injured victim. Okay, so they're not medical bills, they're not pain and suffering, they're not loss of a normal life. Punitive damages are awarded with the intent to punish that defendant, or more importantly, in my opinion anyways, is to deter other people from that same conduct. And so in a trucking case or in a taxi cab case like the one we had, if we find that the trucking company just violated all sorts of safety rules and didn't train their drivers or didn't supervise their drivers and basically let people out on the road that shouldn't be going out on the road, we want to make sure that other companies don't look to this particular case and say, well, these guys got away with it, so I don't need to be doing any of those systems or have any of those systems in place at my own trucking company. So typically when we bring a punitive damages claim, one of the major, and correct me if you think I'm wrong here, Joe, one of the major reasons we do it is because we're highway safety advocates. And so we want more safe trucking companies. If the message that needs to be sent is a punitive damages award, then that's our job.
Corporations can only act through individuals. And, we have a number of cases in which the folks that are hired to get behind the wheel of commercial vehicles, they have no business driving one. And that's what happened in this cab company case we had, was they did absolutely zero vetting of this fella. And if they had done just a simple check of his driving record before, they would have found out that there's no way that this fella should have the keys. But secondly, we've had cases recently, Patrick, where there's been drivers that have been suspended not once, not twice, but maybe 5 or 6 times from driving any vehicle, let alone a commercial vehicle. And, in those types of cases, when people are, entrusting trucking companies, commercial vehicle folks that own those companies to their safety of, themselves and their loved ones, I think there's a place for punitive damages in those cases. And, the truth of the matter is that in Illinois, for example, we have to file a petition to the court to be allowed to seek those punitive damages. And, we do so in the cases that deserve it. We don't in cases that don't deserve it. But unfortunately, there's been a number that we've had where it's just been, frankly, unconscionable that the keys were given to this commercial driver. So, that's why it's important to get an investigation on these things right away.
We have cases, and we've had cases in the past where it's obvious that the driver was just a bad actor. And, we've had defendants that have been driving, under the influence of certain intoxicants. And that's one thing. Unfortunately, I have a lot of cases where the driver is just a really nice person, but it's just been put in an untenable position where they basically weren't given the tools they needed to be successful at their job. That falls on the company, and the company has an obligation to make sure that the people are trained, to make sure they're vetted. But a lot of times the bottom line kind of takes over, and they figure we can save a few pennies on this end. Unfortunately, what that means for our clients is that there's some catastrophic injuries.
So a lot of people, when they're searching around for lawyers, when folks are looking for somebody for a trucking crash case, what kind of questions should they ask?
So I think it's important to ascertain whether or not the attorney that you're going to be hiring has experience in the specific area of law that you need. So we concentrate in trucking cases, or at least I concentrate in trucking cases. When somebody comes in, I expect them to ask me, what is your experience with trucking cases? What kind of results have you gotten in trucking related cases? What are some of the differences between a trucking case versus a sedan versus a sedan case? Because they're vast differences. And I think it's important that you have an attorney that knows intimately the commercial transportation industry so that they're able to make sure that every leaf that needs to be uncovered is uncovered to maximize your recovery.
Yeah, and there's a lot that goes into that as well. Is knowledge of insurance coverage, knowledge of broker and trucker situations. Because one of the things that maybe people don't understand is that there are a lot of parties involved when trucking takes place. Nowadays, we've become an economy that has become a lot of what we call a gig economy. Basically, there's a big company that has got customers that needs drivers. So we're comfortable with that with Uber and Lyft and those types of things. But there's also companies that are what they call themselves brokers, but I basically call them the folks that control the transportation. And basically they need somebody to take, for example, some potatoes from Idaho to Chicago, and they got to find a truck driver to do that. Well, there's apps that they use. They go to their websites, they figure out who's out there, because there's truck drivers, like small, business owner truck drivers that want that work. And there's these big companies that want to transport it. And then there's shippers that need it done. And then there's folks that it's being delivered to. And so all knowing exactly what went down, knowing what the bill of lading shows, knowing who's the broker, who's the seller, who's the receiver, all those things got to be looked at. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I think that's true. So in any shipping transportation contract, there's a number of different parties that you've described. In addition to that, each one of those parties has their own insurance. And then beyond that, each one of those insurance for each party often has insurance stacked on top of it. So you need somebody that understands all of the different moving parts and all of the different insurance issues that are involved in a case, so that you can make sure that you're accessing everything that may be available to you.
What other type of questions should somebody ask when they're looking for a lawyer?
Another one of the big ones, I don't know if it's a question they necessarily should be asking, but it's covered in our book more extensively, but a lot of people are concerned with, how am I going to pay my bills? And so there's a couple different avenues you can use. One, if you have health insurance, I always tell my clients, that's why you have health insurance, is if something bad happens. Well, if you're walking into our office, something bad has happened. So to the extent you can, make sure that the providers know who your health insurer is and provide them that information so that they can bill the health insurance company. And then also, if you have an auto, typically in your automobile insurance, your own insurance policy, you were offered something called medical payment coverage. And that can help you cover some of the bills, especially the bills that come in early, like ER bills and ambulance bills. Typically, we see about $5,000, but it kind of ranges depending on your policy. It could be as little as $500. It could be up to $50,000. So it's important that you know what's in your policy, so you know if you may have a financial backing there that can help you out.
Your loved one's involved in a bad crash. They're recuperating. They're getting a lot of calls from the truck driver's insurance company. Number one, what do you say? Do you think that they should talk to them and record a statement with them?
No. The insurance company adjuster for the trucking company is never, well, in my experience, has never once been out to try to help the client. And they may say, listen, we're going to cover your medical bills. We want to make sure that you're taken care of. The reality is they're not looking to give you more money. Okay. They're looking to keep as much of it in their pockets as possible. And while they may be friendly and they may be good people, their job is with the insurance company. And so anything that you say in a recorded statement or just over the phone with them is something that they may try to use against you ultimately down the road in your litigation.
Well, this is a two-way street. I've often had folks, from these insurance companies, for these big trucking companies, contact me and say, listen, hey, we want to take a recorded statement of your client. And I usually would say, well, listen, I'd like to take a recorded statement of your client, the truck driver, and I want to look at all the records that he created before the crash. I want to look at all these things, without the benefit of a subpoena, all this kind of stuff. And I'm batting zero on that. Absolute 000. They've never, ever let me do that. So why would we allow our client to basically show all the cards when they're not going to show any to me? I mean, does that make sense to you, Patrick?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why when we get a case, we just try to get it on file as soon as possible. So we get in line and then we don't even have to deal with that. We just have the court's backing to help us get the documents we need.
So why should somebody hire a trucking crash lawyer to represent them? I mean, I always tell people the number one reason why people hire us is to delegate the stress of dealing with this situation, which is way bigger than them, to us, because we've dealt with this over and over and over again. Are there any other reasons why you would think that they would want to hire somebody like us?
Yeah, well, trucking cases, even beyond just your typical motor vehicle crash case, they're very complicated. There's all sorts of federal regulations and safety guidelines that these trucking companies have to follow. And so it's important that you find somebody that understands all of those, as well as all of the different moving parties that Joe described earlier. But ultimately, it's the same reason why I don't try to install a new sink in my kitchen, just because I don't do it every day. I want somebody that does it every day to come in and do it the right way. And so that's the same thing as what we do is we do these cases every single day. We understand what we're doing. And so allow us to kind of shoulder the burden of it so that you don't have to.
I wanted to give the listeners a little update on some of the more recent, in the last 1 or 2 years, changes that you've seen in the trucking industry. Can you give us any of those?
Kind of the biggest thing that's helping our cases are the availability of telemetrics. And so telemetrics are, like anything in any industry, it's becoming more data driven. And so these trucking companies need to understand exactly where their trucks are, the routes they're taking, how much gas they're using, because ultimately they're trying to save money, okay? And they're trying to make the whole system, the logistics process, as efficient and streamlined as possible. Well, that data is good for us because it allows us to understand exactly what their operations are, what routes people are taking, whether or not they're being given routes that they can't finish without violating certain rules, like speed violations, for example. The prevalence, I would say, of telemetrics is something that's really come on in the last few years, and I can only imagine it's going to grow, from not just the big trucking companies, but eventually I think every single trucking company will have all sorts of technological equipment available to them.
So one of the things that was somewhat surprising to me when I looked it up was the number one profession in the majority of the states in the U.S. is truck driver. So it used to be, decades ago and maybe even 10 years ago, that these women and men would keep a written logbook, which they would store in their cab, which they would write down when they started driving, basically be a diary of their trip. Is that still happening?
It's not. So what the Department of Transportation found is that too often drivers, for whatever reason, were just being inaccurate with those logbooks. And so what that creates is an environment where people are driving longer than they're allowed to be driving over a day or over a week, and that creates fatigued drivers. And there are so many studies that have come out in the last 10 years about the effect of fatigued drivers in the general public and how dangerous that is. Now you add to that, it's not a 3,500 pound sedan, it's an 80,000 pound tractor trailer, and the effects just get magnified. And so the Department of Transportation decided we can't allow this to be subject to human interpretation. We are going to set up these electronic logbooks, which are actually connected to the computer in the tractor. So they can't be phony to a large extent. It's documented clearly, what hours they're in operation, what hours they're parked, what hours the car is off, etc.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick. I really appreciate you taking time. And again, thanks for writing your book. It's called Avoiding a Trucking Nightmare: What You Need to Know After a Truck-Related Injury. And it's simple to read. It's a good resource, and you can pick it up at shannonlawgroup.com. You should also, if you like the information that we're providing to you, you should subscribe to our YouTube channel at Shannon Law Group. So I hope you enjoyed this taping, and we look forward to hosting more of these tapes in the future. Thank you very much.